In this gambit we will learn a slightly different opening. It's consistently played an unusual opening as white and managed to win nearly every game with it. What's even more remarkable is that these were correspondence chess games, meaning his opponents had plenty of time to think and plan their moves. It turns out that white has a strong pawn majority on the king side, which can be pushed forward to create dynamic attacking opportunities. For example, when the knight develops, it often opens up avenues for aggressive play. Let me walk you through the main line. In most cases, your opponent will notice their pawn is under attack and try to defend it with their knight. You respond by adding another attacker with your knight, and they reinforce the pawn with their bishop. At this point, you essentially ignore the pawn and focus on developing your pieces casually. Interestingly, while black has an extra pawn, it comes with a drawback. The pawn blocks their own bishop, rendering it passive and ineffective on the board. As the game progresses and both sides develop naturally, black often makes a subtle but critical mistake. This allows white to play the strong move e5, which leverages the two central pawns to drive away the knight. What follows is the brilliant sacrifice. Bishop takes f7. This move leads to a decisive attack, ultimately securing victory for white. After the king takes, you play knight to g5. You might already be familiar with this tactical idea, but if not, let me quickly explain. The idea is to deliver a check to the king, forcing it to move. If the king retreats, you bring the queen out, threatening queen to h7 checkmate. At this point, black's only option is to try and escape with their king, but here's where a forced sequence comes into play. This sequence is worth remembering, as it works in many positions involving the sacrifice. Instead of continuing the attack directly, you capture the pawn on f7 with the queen, which is no longer defended by the rook. After that, you continue delivering checks, maintaining relentless pressure until you secure the win. We continue this sequence all the way to checkmate. In a moment, I'll show you some sidelines to handle deviations from the main line. However, I also want to share another fascinating main line that includes a Grandmaster level move, worthy of 4 exclamation marks. In this variation, black plays standard moves initially, but instead of defending with bishop to c5, they might choose the tempting bishop to b4, delivering a check to your king. Here, you calmly play c3, blocking the check. After the exchange, this actually works to your advantage, as it helps you develop your knight. In most cases, your opponent will capture the pawn. If they don't, you'll likely jump to d5 yourself later, creating strong threats and maintaining an active position. We counterattack the bishop, and since it has no better options, they capture the pawn. Now, what can black do next? They're unlikely to develop the knight immediately, as e5 would chase it away. Instead, they typically play d6 first. In response, you develop with bishop to d3, continuing the usual setup. Black then plays knight to f6, and you castle. At this point, if black carelessly castles, it opens the door for you to play e5, forcing the knight to move. This sets up the brilliant sacrifice with bishop takes h7, a recurring and powerful motif in many lines. Instead, black often plays bishop to g4, pinning your knight in an attempt to slow down your attack and prevent you from advancing. However, with their king still stuck in the center, you should push e5 to open the position and launch your attack. While this isn't a strictly forced sequence, I want to show you a beautiful continuation. You attack the knight, forcing a response. Black might either retreat or try to capture, taking advantage of the pin. But in both cases, they're in trouble. For example, if they move the knight, you respond with bishop to c4, attacking the knight twice. The great thing about this position is that if the knight moves anywhere, whether here or elsewhere, you maintain a strong initiative and continue pressing for a decisive advantage. You sacrifice the bishop on f7, a classic tactical idea that lures the king out. Following this, you play knight to g5, delivering a check, not just from the knight, but also a discovered check from the rook. The king is forced to move, and now comes the pivotal moment. The most natural move might seem to be queen takes g4, capturing the bishop. It leaves the king completely exposed, giving white a decisive advantage. However, there's an even more brilliant move waiting to be found. Keep thinking. While queen takes g4 is a strong move, it doesn't end the game immediately, the fight continues. But there is a move that wins on the spot, and it's so unexpected that it's worth savoring the moment. Anyone can play queen takes g4, but the best move in this position is incredibly difficult to spot. The move is rook to f8. At first glance, it seems absurd. Your queen is under attack. Yet instead of responding, you sacrifice the rook for no apparent reason. The rook doesn't capture anything or deliver a check, it's just given away. This shocking move sets up a hilarious sequence. If black captures the rook with their queen, you don't recapture. Instead, you play queen to b3, delivering a check. Black has multiple pieces they can interpose, knight, bishop, or queen, but you simply capture each one. Although this delays the checkmate slightly, it's unavoidable. Ultimately, white delivers a decisive checkmate, leaving no escape for black's king. Black is completely defenseless, even though white only has 2 pieces attacking. Despite being surrounded by defenders, the black king is exposed, and this position is lost. Let's rewind a bit. If black captures with the king, the winning blow for white isn't immediately obvious. The key is a subtle move, queen to f1. This clears the way for the queen to reposition on a better square, utilizing the open file. Once the king retreats to g8 or e7, it doesn't matter which, you deliver the final blow with queen to f7, achieving checkmate. If black tries to be tricky with knight takes e5, hoping to exploit the pin on your knight, you respond with a rare tactical idea, a counterpin. You move out of the pin while simultaneously pinning their knight. This creates a new dilemma for black, as their knight is now vulnerable. From here, black is doomed. You'll capture their knight either with your queen, delivering a check, or with your own knight. Black's best option might be to capture something queen to d3, but after knight takes e5, you attack their queen, threaten their bishop, and set up multiple discovered checks on the next move. This leaves black with no chance of recovery. If black tries something like knight takes g4 with check, you calmly respond. Even if they attempt to recover, you still capture, maintaining the upper hand. For example, if black captures with the knight, they'll lose their queen. If they try another approach, you can respond by capturing either piece. A strong sequence could be knight to f6 first, delivering a check, followed by rook takes e1, also with check. By the end of this sequence, you've gained an extra bishop and secured a completely winning position. Now, let's address another line your opponent might try. They may notice that you're preparing to recapture the pawn with your queen or knight, and decide to overprotect the pawn by playing c5. This is a common response aimed at ensuring you can't reclaim the pawn easily. It's worth noting that if you were to analyze this position with Stockfish, the engine would evaluate it materialistically, showing black as being up a pawn. It might even give a score of -1, since a pawn is worth 1 point in the computer's evaluation system. However, this doesn't account for the dynamic and positional factors favoring white, which make the position highly playable and full of attacking chances. The computer might evaluate this position as simply up a pawn, and give it a score of -1 for black. However, this doesn't tell the whole story. If you look at actual games played by humans, white tends to have a strong win rate here. For example, the move f4 often performs better for white compared to queen takes d4, which is the move a computer would typically recommend to recapture the pawn. This highlights how tricky the position is. Don't blindly trust the computer's evaluation. It might see the extra pawn for black, but for that pawn to actually matter, black must survive white's attack, play flawlessly for the next 25 to 30 moves, and eventually convert the material advantage. For most humans, that's a nearly impossible task. Now, let's consider black's move c5, where they attempt to overprotect the pawn. In this case, I recommend bringing the bishop to c4 instead of d3. Normally, in this line, we place the bishop on d3 to keep it in a sort of ambush, preparing for the brilliant sacrifice later. However, after c5, black weakens key squares along the diagonal, and bishop to c4 takes full advantage of this. In this position, the bishop is even stronger, as black has no way to effectively cover the diagonal.